Welcome to Ignatius Press Off the Shelf. We're continuing and perhaps concluding, we'll see, the discussion of John Henry Newman, a life sacrifice by this phenomenal woman, German woman, Ida Friederike Görres. Her name is actually three times as long as that. But we are towards the end now. We are on chapter 8, Newman's piety, and we're going to get into Newman's conscience. I mean, Newman unconscious, but his conscience too. So, who's in charge here? Joseph.
Well, the first thing I have highlighted is actually on the second page of the chapter, page 188. So, does anybody have anything on the first page? If not, I'll dive in.
I have just a little thing on 187, and that is this beautiful image of the lamp and the table. That the Eucharist, it's quoting Thomas à Kempis, and the light of the Word is the lamp, and the Eucharistic sacrificial meal is the table. I just thought there was something very warm and friendly about that.
We'd like to read it then. If it's warm and friendly, let's get warm and friendly together.
Well, that's all there is to it. He made the profound observations not only about the Holy Mass, and as a result of living based on the Eucharist as well as the Holy Scriptures, the lamp and the table, as Thomas à Kempis calls them. And then it also spells out his other devotions, Mary, the saints, sounds all Catholic to me.
Yes, that's what it was. The saints and the angels actually I want to talk about, because obviously I'm a literature person, and I just wanted two examples. So it mentions his priestly patron, St. Philip Neri, at the top of page 188 there, and then a few lines further down, talking about Newman's love for St. Philip, but then also Newman loved the angels who were so real to him from childhood, especially his guardian angel. So what I thought I would do very briefly, I won't read the whole things, but I want to pluck a couple of lines from Newman's poetry to show his devotion to St. Philip Neri and to the angels. Now, obviously, his famous long poem, The Dream of Gerontius, which was turned into an oratorio by Sir Edward Elgar, has choruses of angels, and one of the very famous ones, the Fifth Choir of Angelicals, is this famous hymn. It became a famous hymn. Praise to the holiest in the height, and in the depth be praise. In all his words, most wonderful, most sure in all his ways. O loving wisdom of our God, when all was sin and shame, a second Adam to the fight, and to the rescue came. O wisest love, that flesh and blood, which did in Adam fail, should strive afresh against their foe, should strive and should prevail. And that a higher gift than grace should flesh and blood refine, God's presence and his very self and essence all divine. So obviously that's line from that poem, which it's become a very well-known hymn, and then carries on with one of the characters.
It's almost finished, but I didn't realize that was from Newman, but finish that off, because there's a tremendous. The next stanza there is terrific. Go ahead.
Look, that's all that I have here in
really?
this. That's all I have here in this. So I don't know. I can't read more than I have. Sorry.
Oh, well, there's there's a part in it where he talks about it. He fought in Man for Man the Foe, but the double fight that he fought, both the agony, the physical agony, and the mental agony, but the way it's done in poetry is really stunningly beautiful. I'm sorry that's not there.
I'm sorry that this obviously has sin of omission.
Everybody look that up. What are the first lines, Joe? Praise the Holy, praise the Holy in the height. Look that up.
Yeah,
look at the whole hymn. It's a phenomenal hymn.
I will. That's obviously the opening line, and that's what that hymn's known by. And then there's a wonderful song called "The Pilgrim Queen." On the previous page, it mentions, of course, Newman's devotion to the Blessed Virgin. But this wonderful poem, "The Pilgrim Queen," is about the history of England, inspired by Lady of Walsingham. But I just want the final stanzas of this, final stanza of this poem. A moment, she said, and the dead shall revive. The giants are failing. The saints are alive. I am coming to rescue my home and my reign. And Peter and Philip are close in my train. So again, you think they're Peter and Philip, probably St. Peter and St. Philip the Apostle, but it's actually St. Peter, as in Rome, right? That England is going to return to Rome under the patronage of the Blessed Virgin. But Philip is St. Philip Neri. And then he wrote a wonderful poem called Guardian Angel. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but maybe I'll read just the first two stanzas. Just way to illustrate this piety that Ida Friederike Görres is talking about. So, Guardian Angel, first two stanzas. My oldest friend, mine from the hour when first I drew my breath, my faithful friend that shall be mine, unfailing till my death. Thou hast been ever at my side, my maker to thy trust, consigned my soul, what time he framed the infant child of dust. So here we get practical examples in Newman's poetry of his piety. I thought I would share.
Wonderful, beautiful.
Okay, now I've got it here. And
Okay.
when I first looked it up, it had just what you had. But here's how it continues. O generous love that he who smote in man for man the foe, the double agony in man for man should undergo. And in the garden secretly, that's the mental, and on the cross on high, that's the physical, should teach his brethren and inspire to suffer and to die. I mean, I don't know why they leave that thing out, but I mean, that is so beautiful.
I know.
Oh, generous love is he who smote in man, for man, the foe, the double agony in man, for man should undergo. I mean, that's just phenomenal.
Absolutely beautiful. Well done, and bravo to you for knowing and remembering that, because I didn't even realise that there was more after that. So
I didn't remember it. I just looked it up on my phone.
well, but you remembered it was there. You remembered it was good. You just had to get the exact words.
Well,
so you know,
I sing it at least once a month because it's one of the hymns for the Sunday prayer in the office.
Oh, I didn't know that. Okay.
It credits Newman?
It does not. I mean, it just says to him. I didn't know it was Newman.
Huh.
Yeah.
Praise to the holiest in the height, and in the time we pray. Da 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 da.
Well, probably
da,
the
da,
tune.
da, 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 da. It's also got a beautiful melody. I'm not sure who put the melody to it, but it's got a beautiful melody.
Well,
obviously Edward Elgar set the whole of the poem from which that comes, the Dream of Grontius, to an oratorio. But I must confess, I don't know whether that hymn tune is part of that or whether that's a separate composition, just by somebody who wrote the hymn itself. I don't know. I have nothing else in this chapter except for the final page on page 194. So I'm sure some of you will have something.
Well,
before then.
This stanza or two that Father just read to finish off that hymn that's a poem, you know, this winning in man for man, the incarnation, that God became man in order to win in man and for man. I mean, that is really something worth contemplating. And it ties in with his deep veneration for the Sacred Heart of Jesus. Now that can be rendered, in very art that Father Fessio doesn't like. Okay.
Or Benedict either.
And so, but if you really think about this idea of Jesus having a human heart, along with his human body, and that means human emotions and human, that to have that remembrance that he suffered as a man in order that man might have the victory through him. I mean, this is, and now that's the path of every man, to win the fight with Christ, right? So he had a whole chapel dedicated to the Sacred Heart, and there you go.
Yes, I like the various different pious devotions that he had, from obviously the Holy Mass, as you mentioned, Vivian, and obviously the Blessed Virgin, but these saints and angels and the Sacred Heart, all good stuff. But so I have nothing else until the final page of the chapter, which is on page 194.
Well, the dream of Gerontius is mentioned here, Joseph, on page 190. His concern for the poor souls, meaning those in purgatory, is perhaps the most beautiful meditation on the departing soul. And I read the poem when I came across this in the book, because I'd never read it before, The Dream of Gerontius. And now that this beautiful hymn, anyway, it's kind of all coming together for me here.
In actual fact, I think it was C.S. Lewis, if I'm remembering correctly, that said he preferred Newman's treatment of, should we say, the purgatorial dimension of the afterlife in the Dream of Grontius to Dante's view of it in the Divine Comedy. So Lewis obviously actually admired Newman's theology of the afterlife as expressed in that poem.
That's very interesting on Lewis's part.
All right, onward. I'm listening.
Well, as I said, I've got 194, so I'm waiting for anybody to intervene.
Nope.
But I see Vivian is almost the whole page underlined. But go ahead, Joseph.
Because kind of it sums everything up.
Yeah, so I just the final Latin phrase there on page 194, the final line of the chapter, ex umbris et imaginibus in veritatem, which is translated in the footnote here is from shadows and images into truth, which are the words Newman selected to be engraved on his tombstone. So obviously there it's a very important epigram for us to know if we want to know Newman's piety and indeed Newman as a person. But of course this is obviously reminiscent in one sense of Plato, of course, that the ultimate reality is the form and not various accidental manifestations of it. But also, again, coming back to Lewis, who obviously comes after Newman, Lewis's repetition of this life being the shadowlands, and that and at the end of the Chronicles of Narnia, that the real story hasn't begun yet. That the real story begins. I think he calls this life in the final chapter of The Last Battle, the final book in the Chronicles of Narnia. He calls that our life in this world only the cover and the title page of the book, and the real story only begins after we die. So it seems to be Newman seems to be saying something very similar there. That this is just a place of shadows of and images, whereas the truth, capital T, is what we experience if and when, and please God, we enter the eternal presence of God in heaven, because that's the truth himself.
And this is a very common patristic trope, that we live in the land of images and shadows, but we're going to see the reality and the glorification only at the final coming or at our death.
Well, you mentioned Plato, the allegory of the cave. The men are facing the wall, the fire is behind them, and so all they're seeing is shadows cast up on the wall, and they think that those shadows are the real thing. And it's not until they turn around that they start to see that, oh, what I've been looking at has been only shadows. Okay, so turning around, well, that's the meaning of conversion.
Yep.
You have to turn around. It's a 180-degree turn too. It's not part of the way. You have to do a full 180. That's what conversion is. So what a beautiful epithet, actually.
Yeah, it's a nice way to end that chapter, I think, on his piety, because it goes to the heart of heaven itself. And now chapter 9, if you can call it a chapter, it's just two poems.
Two poems, short poems, yeah.
Yeah, I'm puzzled and perplexed, and I'm wondering whether one of you can throw some light on it, because there doesn't seem to be any explanation as to why these two particular poems, as opposed to many others that could have been chosen, that Ida Görres selects. Is there a method to her madness?
I don't know.
Can't tell you.
It's weird. Okay, well, I have nothing else I want to say about them, except that I wondered why. I was trying to think of some connection to the theme of the book, but I'm not seeing anything obvious.
All right, well, let's turn to chapter 10. It's actually part 2. I mean, the book is sort of unequally divided. We've got these 9 chapters, of which chapter 9 is only 2 pages. And now we have part 2, which is about 1/10 of the book, and it's on conscience, chapter 10.
Yeah, and I know that Vivian said that she's got a lot here. It's very dense. The first thing I actually have highlighted is not until page 212. So I'm going to sort of sit back and cruise while Vivian does the work.
Well, I it's very dense. And I wasn't prepared to lead a discussion on it, but I'll throw out to you an example of what I think this whole thing is saying, because he's making the distinction between the conscience and moral reasoning. He's saying these are not the same thing. Moral reasoning is what the human mind does actually in response to the conscience, either to affirm what the conscience is saying or to argue with what the conscience is saying. Okay, so he sees moral reasoning as flawed and something that needs to be not mistrusted completely, but not deserving of what as much as what the conscience deserves. Well, why? Because the conscience, he's saying, this is directly the voice of God speaking to the human person. And that's why it's the whatever page it is where that's his most important proof of God. This is on the bottom of 205 for Newman. Conscience is the primary, most foundational, and most important proof of God. And that means a lot for someone who is not a skeptic of the usual academic proofs of God, but is peculiarly indifferent to and unaffected by them. He knows them and acknowledges them, but they are not meaningful to him. And here's a quote from Newman himself from the Apologia. Were it not for this voice speaking so clearly in my conscience and my heart, I should be an atheist or pantheist or polytheist when I looked into the world. I'm speaking for myself only, and I am far from denying the real force of the arguments in proof of a God. Okay, so now I'm struggling with, okay, so what, because the conscience can also be flawed because it can be malformed. However, so it's as if God speaking to you through the mist or the fog, right? The fog can get in the way, but the fact that God is speaking directly to every human soul, this confidence, this incredible confidence that he has that man created the image of God, God is speaking directly to the human soul, every human soul. Okay, however much the mist can get in the way. All right, so, and then the reasoning comes later. So I thought, I was trying to think of a concrete example of this, and I thought of a woman I met along the way, not a Catholic. She had a number of children, which raised eyebrows in a place like San Francisco. And so at one of her doctor visits, the doctor recommended that she get her tubes tied. Like, you've got too many children, you shouldn't have any more, you should get your tubes tied. And she said, well, what are you even talking about? So he handed her a brochure that explained what the procedure was. He said, you take this home, discuss it with your husband, and get back to me. So she's relating this experience to me, and she said, now, this woman's not a Catholic. She's not had much of a Christian formation or education. She takes this brochure home and she reads it, and she said, I recoiled completely from this brochure. And I couldn't even tell you why, but I went back to the doctor and I said, there's no way I'm letting you touch my body ever again. Not only this procedure, but anything else. You are an untrustworthy doctor. And so I, having the Catholic moral theology bit of training, I was able to say, oh, well, what the Catholic Church has to say about these kinds of things, like the integrity of the body, and why would you deliberately harm or remove a functioning organ, and blah, blah, blah. That was all after her experience of her conscience just kind of recoiling in horror at something. Now, many people, before I read Newman on this, I really was under the misapprehension of that being kind of an emotional reaction, only subjective, emotional, and now we need the intellect in here to, but after reading this, I'm realizing, no, that was that woman's conscience having this aversion to something objectively evil. And yes, now the church in her practiced moral theology can come in and explain why this is so. But you see, that's my example. That's the best I can do with this material.
Well, let me back up a step then. You talked about the distinction between moral reason and conscience. But there's a further division there. Above that, there's theoretical reasoning, and then you've got moral reason and conscience. And for Newman, who was brilliant and certainly was a person who could reason in a theoretical sense, uh, that's still your own reason. That's your self thinking. You're doing the work, okay? When it comes to conscience, moral reason, again, you're thinking about it, you're reflecting on it, you're making excuses or whatever. But conscience is not you. There's
Yes.
something that wait a minute, I that wasn't my thought. Where'd that come from? And that's why I think Newman
Yeah.
uses that as the most important proof of God. Is that hey, why am I reacting this way? I don't want to do it that way. I want to do it this and not that. But no, there's a judge above me, which is telling me no. And you mentioned about the conscience being, misformed. That's true over time. But his point is also it's your conscience that the first time you hear it, that's what you should follow, not thinking about it a lot. And of course, you think about it a lot, you can dull your conscience.
Yes.
And pretty soon, I mean, I've had that experience with some penitents that they actually didn't think was sinful, you know. Well, that's because over time they convince themselves. But
Yes.
at the beginning, the initial response to something which is truly evil is that I'm repulsed by it.
I'm repulsed by it. And that, sometimes we just refer to that as an emotional subjective response, as opposed to what Newman is saying is that's the voice of God
Exactly.
causing you to be repulsed by something that's evil.
Exactly.
Yeah, I'm going to contribute two things to that. First of all, I'm going to use Newman's words just below what you just quoted, Vivian, which it seems to be that he places conscience as an objective voice of God, as we've been discussing, and as the ultimate foundational first principle for the existence of God. So this just about 10 lines down on page 206. If I am asked why I believe in a God, I answer that it is because I believe in myself. For I feel it impossible to believe in my own existence. Of that fact I am quite sure, the fact that he exists, without believing also in the existence of him who lives as a personal, all-seeing, all-judging being in my conscience. Okay, so that's that. But I want to play, I don't know necessarily devil's advocate, but I guess it really does depend upon how we are defining conscience here, because that there are many people that in conscience today believe that a woman's right to choose an abortion is a good thing, and they will fight for that right in good conscience as they see it. In Nazi Germany and in Soviet Union, there are ideologically motivated communists and Nazis who, in good conscience, did deplorable things because they thought they were serving a higher good than the lesser good that they were doing, which was an evil. So to what I suppose it just depends upon how we're defining conscience. But that if giving ourselves permission without feeling guilty to do something rooted in our understanding of truth can be called conscience, then obviously conscience is not the objective word of God in our hearts or minds, but on the contrary, it's our feeling good about our belief system.
Well, let me be devil's advocate and you're devil's advocate, okay? I mean, let's take butchering animals. Whether you think that's bad or good, forget that. But the point is, the very first time I think that a child would be confronted with killing a cat or butchering, they would be repulsed by that. But you do it again and again and again. In fact, that's what they did in the communist countries and in the German countries. They would force you to do things which were repulsive until they were no longer repulsive. I don't think you're talking, Joseph, about an untrained conscience or an untainted conscience. You're talking about the conscience of someone who's already overcome the natural disgust. There is good and bad objectively. And if we're not influenced by our own moral reasoning or other people posing on us, we recognize it's not good to kill someone, It's not good to steal. But, if you do it long enough, your conscience gets dulled. So I do think that the moral sense in us reaches moral truth, but it can be disturbed or muddied or distorted.
Well, that's the other distinction I want to make as well, because we talk about moral reasoning can be flawed, whereas the conscience is a safer guide because it's the objective voice of God in Newman's description of it here. But I think we also need to distinguish between human reasoning, moral or otherwise, and reason or logos. Because obviously, when the Catholic Church insists upon the union of faith and reason, it's talking about reason as something which is objectively true and infallibly so, which is different from our process of reasoning, which is subject to our own, first of all, limitations as a creature, but also our perversions as a fallen, broken, sinful creature. Our pride can pervert the process of reasoning, which is what we're talking about here. But we do need to distinguish between reason and our ability or inability to do it because of our limitations and our sins.
Right. And the question, Lewis mentions this in Miracles, that some people hold that there are two faculties, reason and moral conscience, and some hold that it's the same faculty in two different uses, reflecting on or the principles of reason, non-contradiction, and so on, and the principles of morality, good and bad. It doesn't matter whether it's two faculties or one; it's in one soul. But I think Newman's point is that the the initial first response you have to something which has a moral quality to it, it could be good or evil, you can trust that better than your later reasonings, which try to maybe excuse it or get around it.
Yeah, that's fine. I just thought
Yeah.
the
I want to say
the,
something
the extra time spent on that was probably important, so that we're not confusing ourselves or anybody else.
on page 209, the new paragraph there. She is now Newman is now, or Görres, quoting Newman or whatever, is talking about people who by moral reasoning dull their or skew their true conscience. And so this is not what Newman thinks, but the separation of moral reason from obedience to God is the real root of every degeneration of conscience, because only both, inseparably united, form a healthy conscience. Well, that wasn't the quote I wanted, but anyway.
But you've brought up a very important point, because
Yeah.
Newman does link this voice of God that we hear to whether or not we obey it. And so these people who try to use their conscience not to obey a revealed law of God, are contradicting themselves. And this is why we need the authority of the church, which is one reason why Newman became a Catholic, because it had this authority to, help us with our faulty reasoning, right? And so on page 210, at the top there, 3 lines down, everything that is called formation of conscience, therefore, has a standard, whether one wants to be obedient to it. That's the standard. According to Newman, obedience is the essence of religion, not as if love were absent from it. It is love as obedience, loving obedience, obedient love, which it has its law in the will of the beloved Lord. The way Newman brought together conscience, obedience, and love, this to me has been just, I told you, I read this chapter twice. I was just so moved by this depth of his understanding of all of this, which kind of cuts through so much of the, baloney.
Yeah.
Conscience and the laws of the church.
What you've just read there about the connection between love and obedience, it reminds me also of the book, wonderful book that St. John Henry Newman, St. John Paul II wrote, Love and Responsibility. that the love cannot be separated or divorced from responsibility. What is responsibility? It is doing what we should. It is being obedient to our conscience and to what love requires of us. So if love and responsibility are indissolubly married, you can see here how love and obedience, because really that's what responsibility is. It's being obedient to what we should do, right?
And love of obedience is the summation of who Christ is. Christ is the obedient son who loves the Father. He obeys because he loves the Father, and he's willing to love and obey to the point of death. And so now we who lack that kind of love, that filial love for God, right? We now, because of him, back to this, what he does in us in order to do it for us and with us, we now can be obedient sons too through Christ. Because let's face it, folks, we're not going to do it on our own.
So a couple of things consistent with this. I mean, that's just John's letters. He who says he loves God but does not keep the commandments is a liar. So obedience is part of love. Secondly, I totally agree with what you just said, the two of you, and I picked the wrong quote. It was a good quote, but I said this was not Newman. Well, this quote I had was Newman and Görres, and the quote I was thinking about on page 203, about a third of the way down. This is from the other side, people who are making excuses of themselves. Quote, one enters into agreement with God, and from there he masters the situation with confidence. Close quotes. This is written in 1946 or thereabouts. And then Newman, of course, is writing in 1800s. This is what was called the fundamental option.
Yes.
That as long as you love God and serving God, well, then you can make your choices. Be okay as long as you don't alter that basic relationship. But Newman is saying, no, you have to follow the commandments, the specific thing. You can't just say, oh, I generally love God, but I can do this. But interesting to me that Newman described that a century before it occurred.
Yes, because what was that called again? The fundamental option.
Yeah.
And I remember reading that in the so-called new moral theology that was coming out.
Yeah.
And I have to say that when you first start reading this stuff, you start to go, well, that kind of makes sense, love and do what you will. Who said that? Augustine,
yeah.
But no, that implies that now just leave the thinking to me, God, because you and I, we're buddies. We know each other. We're friends. We love each other. So now I'll do the thinking, and I don't have to now put myself in this humble position vis-a-vis the authority of the church on an ongoing basis in my life,
I think we've essentially finished this book. There's an encore on page 235, which is kind of notes that Görres took, but it doesn't. It basically, resumes or summarizes what we've already talked about in the first part of the book. So it's, phenomenal book. I liked it because she has so many quotations, and she bases her opinions and reflections on so many sources from Newman, a lot of letters, and a lot of different sermons, that you get a view of Newman, which I don't know you wouldn't get if you just read his books.
For sure.
Any final words, Joseph or Vivian?
No, I think you're right. I've got other things highlighted, but I think this is a good time and a good place to wrap up. This has been a good book with which to conclude the our off the shelf, put off the shelf back on the shelf, as you said. It's been a joy being with both of you for quite a number of years. I think I've lost count. But we've read lots of good books together in a deep and meaningful way, and I hope that those who have watched it watched the podcast have got as much out of it as I have.
Amen.
Amen.
And so we'll not say au revoir, which means until we see each other again, but rather adieu. Go with God. Vaya con Dios. Thanks, everybody, and God bless you.